shoveling coal from the face to the furnace. Smoke spews, spitting blood. Stoking boilers, steam under pressure. Venting turbines, current becomes power. Coal production. China, 2,380 million tonnes. 6,000 known miners dead. 70,000 cases of lung disease a year. USA, 1,053 million tonnes. 28 known miners dead. 30,000 new cases of lung disease each year. India, 492 million tonnes, unknown miners dead, unknown cases of lung disease. Computers jolt into life, crash and reboot, volts flickering, flowing through the logic gates of promise, lung disease, pneumocosis and white finger. Coal dust everywhere, open wounds of the past present, compressed into our white goods, trapped into the soot of our chimneys, fired into our processors. Infected computers speak of compensation. Minus total claims 592,000, live 241,000, deceased 351,000, claims settled 581,000, administration costs 2.3 billion, including 1.3 billion claims for legal fees. Miners' average claim £3,000. Coal dust blows east to China and south to India, setting the earth on fire with its blackness. Children grovel over slag, trading food for pharmacosis. 500,000 people die each year of coal-related lung disease, and many of those are remaining invisible to the database machines they fuel, caught up in the routine atrocity of producing our computers and powering them. Each computer takes over 250 kilos of fossil fuel to produce. Our way of life consumes bodies. Lungs turn black, bones malform to feed the machine, muscles ripped and brains bludgeoned as we progress and develop to a destination that never comes. We need the nameless poor to die for us, moving on from slave labour to factories to deregulated enterprises. Slaves were branded, recorded, numbered, classified and priced. Today, most Chinese and Indian mine workers never even enter into our ledgers and databases. Their underground and invisible labour is the lifeblood of a free market where nameless bodies are no more value than the coal dust that enters their lungs. Stoke the boiler. We started this project about a year ago, I think. I've got to take these glasses off or you're all really misty. And it was an investigation really into coming up here and looking at the industrial past of this area, thinking about the way that it seems that flesh and the machine are kind of very inseparable. And so what we decided to do was I began trying to find a way that I could connect to both the historic past in the way that media emerges from the mine. And it's not really a way that we normally think about media, but if you think about it, so those dark satanic mills of William Blake, the steam engine emerges first from the mine. Then it starts to make rails for itself. Then those rails turn into telegraphs. Then those telegraphs turn into telephones. All the substances in those medias have all been dug out of mines. That's how we get it into the wires, into these incredible networks. And so media emerges from the mine, and also the social conditions of its manufacture emerge from the mine. The way the mines work go into factories. And so for us, for me, trying to connect the steam engine from 100 years ago or 200 years ago to a computer now kind of had a huge symbolic resonance to it. But at the same time, I mean, last Tuesday was the anniversary of the end of the strike?
Yeah, well, about the 3rd or the 4th of March, yeah.
So as I was trying to think about how these things could emerge, we kind of collided with the deep social context of the miners' strike. And Jean began to talk to miners, and we began to understand the relationship of the miners' strike to the displacement of coal production. And I think what I should do is, I'll hand over to Jean so that he can explain that side of it.
Thank you. I started, I think, in in January, and I've been living in this country a while, but actually I'd never come up to Newcastle. And although I did study international politics in Wales, which was also a mining area, the strike was never mentioned, which I was telling you yesterday, Dave. So it was also, for me, it was a real sort of unknown coming here. But I found that people were really open and still, I guess, like proud of what they did, and they made my job really easy in a way, and people were really willing to talk. Although I guess the common understanding is that the miners were defeated, I think they weren't defeated, and I think the idea of social matrix and communities is really strong, and I think they're really keen also to pass it on to like newer generations, and I think that's where it's a bit difficult, because we're not as organized around the pit as people were at the time. The other thing we found out was the compensation claims, which I think I should say a word about. That's all right. In the 1950s, it was recognized that black lung disease was caused by the mining, and so it took another 40 years for the government to accept that they were liable in that. And so we came to the Coal Health Compensation Scheme in '98, but this was drawn up with lawyers, and in the end the miners got very little out of that, and the lawyers ripped off all the benefits from it, and I guess other administrators as well. I think I don't want to say too much because we've got Dave here, and I don't want to talk too much on behalf of the miners. I think it's better if you do it.
I'd prefer not to use the mic if that's all right, and I'll stand up because I can't talk sitting down basically. Well, there's so much that could be said, right, you know, about every aspect of really the stuff we're outlined. But I think it's interesting the fact that we had the computers down in the Discovery Museum powered by the big traction engine outside, which was coal-fired, of course. So the computers themselves were coal-fired, and the teenagers who come in and were playing on the computers were asking what was the relevance of the machine outside with the belch and the smoke. And when we said, you know, it powers the computers, you could see the non-comprehension. Like, how can that thing with the coal like make this work? You know? Well, they can be forgiven really, because Harold Wilson had much the same kind of idea, because he never understood where electricity came from either. Harold Wilson, in case anybody doesn't know, closed more coal mines than Maggie Thatcher did, but because Labour shit doesn't stink, basically, nobody did out about it, or very little local resistance. But it's also because we were like the buffalo, and there were so many of us, you didn't notice a few hundred going down every couple of years. Until it started to get a bit lonely in the field and you realised something's happening here. Now, Wilson made his great speech about the white-hot heat of modern technology and contrasted it to these miners working stripped to the waist or naked in thin seams, 18-inch seams, 2-foot seams that we worked up here, in water, and, you know, and really it was inhuman, and we should get them out of there, because nuclear power was this benign force which would save us all and take humanity forward. Of course, he didn't know where uranium came from. He didn't realise that the miners who dug the uranium in Namibia and South Africa were working in conditions 100 times worse than the coal miners. So he hadn't a clue either about where the energy came from. I think really, you know, we need to understand a little bit about the political and social, and politics is coal. Coal is politics, particularly on this island, and it's hard to understand anything of the history of the development of industrialism and imperialism and politics and the political views without an understanding of coal. That's why anybody who sets off with the idea of understanding the 84-85 miners' strike and thinks it's just about job losses is severely missing the point. I mean, a person who loses a job at Woolworths, of course, is quite upset about it, and it devastates their particular family. But the the attitude towards the social cleansing and economic change that happened with the coal industry was something of a qualitatively different order, and behind it was a much bigger plan that took place. Now, I mean, you could ask for a long time, we could make a long talk about why did they come to the conclusion that they needed to get rid of it. In brief, it was to do with power, of course, not just the power of industry, but the power of politics and social force. For reasons too long to mention here, the miners had developed over a period of, and by the way, we started commercially mining coal in this city before the Normans came. And I'm not on about, you know, a couple of monks gone doing a well on the end of a rope. You know, I'm on about commercially mining coal. Before the Civil War, the miners and keelmen's union was very established here, both of whom had fiery reputations for strikes, sabotage and riot, which they persisted in for a couple of hundred years. And in a way, the miners started to manufacture a political character, which the ruling class was very fearful of. There's also the fact, of course, that the coal owners had an arrogant social and economic legacy from the past, insofar as the vast majority of them were aristocrats, because they owned the land where the coal seams lay underneath. It was your Lord Joyce's and your Lord Londonderry who developed the coal mines and brought the arrogance of the feudal period and the Norman conquest almost into the social relations with the men. So the miners were fighting a deeply entrenched social outlook and realised very rapidly, you know, that there wasn't going to be much room to get any justice within this scope of this social system. And since we were such a powerful force, that we started to develop ideas of using that political force as a means of social change, to the extent that by the time I went in the industry, being a coal miner was synonymous with being some kind of social rebel. That called us the storm troops of the TUC in the 70s, a description which we were happy to accept, because being a miner meant you not only came from a political culture, but also that you had the means of fighting for social change, not just for ourselves, but over the whole shebang. And we influenced political movements here, right? I mean, that half of the executive of the Chartist movement were the executive of the miners. And particularly the physical force wing up here was represented by the miners. So people that were looking for a radical change tended to be rooted in that political and social power in the mines. So it didn't endear us to the ruling class. When coal was the only source of power, then it was absolutely essential that they had to. We always came back, even if we were defeated, even if we were wiped out or shot or whatever. Then the miners would always re-emerge as a social force, because they couldn't do without coal. So it took a while before. Am I going on too long about irrelevancies?
I just have I've got a couple of questions I want to ask you.
Okay.
And I think probably, you know, I'd really like us.
I'll just conclude that bit, and then we can throw it, because obviously, like I say, you could talk all day, and I probably would about the subject. Coming to thought, let's say after the defeat of Ted Heath in 1974, alarm bells started ringing in the constitutional parties as to here we had an industrial union which was capable of challenging the state and not waiting for the niceties of an election every 5 years. And it set alarm bells ringing in Labour and in the Tories as to ways they could take on, engage the miners in the struggle and defeat them. Both Labour and the Tories drew that up, and the plans that they drew came together in 84-85. Just to say this, nothing in the struggle in 84-85, and then the final struggle, which people forget about, was in 92 and 93 with John Major. And it was John Major who delivered the coup de grace and wiped out really the last 55,000 miners from Britain. It's an interesting figure because we produced 50 million tonne of coal and prior to John Major's extermination process, and we now import near enough 50 million tonne of coal. So it was never about that they didn't like coal, it was they didn't like the miners. The difference is that 50 million tonne of coal is produced in conditions 1,000 times worse than the conditions we produced it in here.
I think there's a couple of things that really come out of this for me. One was that last weekend I went to the miners' event in the Bridge Hotel pub, and something that astonished me and really affected me was the vision that people had, that the way that 500,000 people could actually resist the powers of government and the powers of huge corporate interest. But their vision was so strong and so striking and so absent from today that really affected me, you know, kind of enormously, because I was kind of like, you know, I knew about the strike and had miners stay and things, but that was a huge feeling for me last weekend and blew me off a bit. But what was really important with the strike for me was that on re-evaluating it, that I could trace back all kind of globalisation. You know, it was like that vision needed to be destroyed. The vision that you could have another force of power within a society that wasn't political had to be destroyed in order for, you know, when they changed all the things in the City of London, freed up the market, all those kinds of things, that the displacement of production somewhere else. So now young people, when they, you know, or younger people, when they buy something, they don't think about the consequences of where it's come from. And what I really enjoyed yesterday was that we had some, you know, quite difficult art with the lungs going, fitted to the steam engine, and we had you on the other side, and we had over 2,000 people apparently yesterday. And so I wanted to ask you, how did you feel about being in that context with the art on one side, the steam engine blokes outside? How did it feel for you?
Well, I've been around a bit, you know, so I helped Jeremy Deller during his reconstruction of the Battle of Orgreave.
Oh,
and then he won the new Tate award.
That's right, yeah.
And he had an exhibition, and I made an exhibition of myself there because I was there with the Union banner, and people were able to come up and talk about the banner. Unfortunately, he didn't say that in his programme as people come in, and it just said you can talk to Dave. And it was a bit like the Monty Python sketch, you know, because people would come up and say, well, what do you want to talk about? I said, well, I'm not really here just to talk about anything, like, you know, somebody had to talk about the context of the banner. You know, it was like kind of my conversation thing. So I found it not too difficult, you know, yesterday, but it was, I mean, it was interesting because of the number of people, like I said, teenagers are interested about that. Lots of old people talking about industrial Tyneside, where we were then, and what values meant, and where we are now.
There was a lot of ex-miners coming in yesterday as well, and I thought it was really interesting that the cleaners in the Discovery Museum were ex-miners as well, and spent a lot of time with the work. So the work, you know, so all the components of the work resonated in lots of different ways, from like young people encountering these issues for the first time, and then, you know, like ex-miners being able to, you know, look at all the gala stuff, all the book work. And it's the first time really that, as an experiment for us, it's the first time that we tried not to like privilege the artwork and have the artwork, the activism, you know, and the archaeology with the steam engine all on the same level. And so that was really important for us to see what would happen. And then being in the Discovery Museum was really important because we had so many families coming through and people that normally didn't encounter any of those things, or if they did, they never encountered them together. So the complexities of, you know, at the moment we don't know what to do. We turn on the telly or we do a Google search and we're burning coal and we're burning up people's bodies, but no one at the moment really knows what to do. And in order to do that, the great thing about an art space is that you can bring those things into the same proximity. There's nowhere else left, nowhere free in this society where you can bring elements together and allow people to reflect on them, you know what I mean, in a way that then allows them to imagine maybe a different world or maybe a different way of doing things. But maybe we should get Jean to talk a bit more.
No, I was kind of thinking maybe if you want to say a little bit more about this generational issue, because most of the people I've spoken with about the strike are people probably over 60 years old now. And I think that they also kind of struggle, I think, with their own children, let alone members of the public, to pass on this kind of feelings that they had then, or that kind of like solidarity. I think the other thing is that although it was 25 years ago, people talk about it like it was yesterday, and the hatred for Margaret Thatcher is really still very present. Met this lady who said that she on the day the strike ended, she bought this bottle of champagne, and although it was some kind of like not a good time for them, she used the money to buy a bottle of champagne, and the bottle of champagne is still in her fridge 25 years on, and she's like, you know, I will pop that cork when Margaret Thatcher dies. And it is something that, I mean, that was, I remember telling you about this, and that encapsulated so much for me. But this is then something I've heard, not just from her, but other people who like want to organize a party when she dies or something. So there is something really strong about this. You want to say a bit about the generation?
I think that, and hopefully what my book demonstrates is that it didn't actually finish in '85, you know, and in fact, when the dust settled, we were still there. And I mean, Arthur Scargill always says we didn't lose the '85 strike, and we all think, well, thank God, because if that was winning it, I'd hate to bloody know it. What losing it was like. But in a sense, it's not totally mad, because they hadn't achieved their objectives, and which is why they had to come back 10 years later. And in a way, that year from 92 to 93 was in many ways even more soul-wrenching and heart-wrenching than the 45 one, particularly for the women, because a lot of the men wanted out by then and had enough. And it was the women who took that campaign forward, you know. So we hadn't really lost in '85. It wasn't until really '94 and the John Major thing that we came to an end. But it is very hard to maintain some kind of spirit and hope in the community these days. I mean, mining communities now have the highest rates of unemployment right throughout the country. You can see it as a pattern. The highest rates of unemployment, the lowest educational expectation, the highest rate of infantile mortality, the highest benefit dependency, the lowest life expectancy, the highest benefit dependency, and you can go through and it reads like a catalogue of despair. We also have antisocial crime, which we never had, very prevalent heroin addiction, which we never had, on the back of that. And for people who've lost belief in themselves, they've got no belief in the community. And the kinds of things that happen in pit communities now were inconceivable. And the worst part of it isn't all of that. The worst part of it is people can't see a way out. There's no way out. When we've been defeated in the 20s and we were defeated in the 30s, people always knew they had to come back for coal, they had to come back and the union would get strong again. The union has no answers now. I mean, the belief that Labour would come riding over the hill like the cavalry to rescue us, nobody believes that. If those horses still exist, they're gone in the wrong direction. So there's a total loss and a despair which reflects in the young people's loss of expectation. That's not total, by the way, and if Rachel was here, she'd kick us up the arse for saying that. Because one of the lasses who've been speaking from the pit communities is a person from this generation. She's in her 20s, and she was born into a community where its heart had been ripped out. But it's not a total thing, and there are people like her about.
I'd like to ask another thing, maybe to Graham this time. It's a comment rather than a question, but it's something that we started thinking about as we were dealing with the displacement of coal. Because the first idea was that maybe I would go over to India and try to source the coal, and we would use that coal and document where it was coming from and so on. And it was impossible to do that, but we did research it quite a lot and spend like hours trying to find things. And what we find is that you reach a certain level and then you can't find anything. It's like a void. I don't want really to use the word void, but it's like something that just doesn't get, you know, controlled, because that's what we're working on. The control society is how everything is getting monitored, everything is getting recorded, everything is getting checked. And then we've got this sort of invisible force, but that is actually the sort of lifeblood of our computers, right?
Yeah.
This is the reason this is possible is those kind of mine workers in India and China, and you mentioned it as well, the fact that conditions have gone back probably like 200 or 250 years back. And yeah, do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I think you know, like developing ideas around, you know, politics and media and power. One of the interesting things is that we got very used to, especially my students will know this, or at Goldsmiths, we got very used to this idea of societies of control, in which the kind of machine, every time you phone up, someone says, you know, like, oh no, that's not my concern, they pass you on to the next department. The way that those things work, the way the call centres work, the way that, like, you can never get to the heart of anything anymore. Or the way in your car you're driving, but the sat-nav, you know, directs your body, you know, in one direction or another. So you're always within this kind of mapped, or these systems of control. And we got very used to the idea, or it's very prevalent at the moment, that will only multiply, because that level of control comes out of, you know, Turing's machine, because the computer itself is all about a model and a controlled model. And so as a conceptual machine, it has to keep creating control, because it's a control system. And so we got very used to that idea, and that was how it was going to be. And then as me and Jean kind of, and Matsuko progressed on the project, we discovered more and more that actually for that to stay, you need an unrecorded, an unknown number of bodies fed into the machine somewhere. And then we thought, oh, well, people would just say, oh, well, you know, like eventually they'll be able to send their kids to school, or eventually, you know, their conditions will improve. But it doesn't seem to be that way whatsoever. If anything, it's got worse. Because as we've kind of reduced air coal miners, you know, they've just expanded elsewhere, and coal production is increasing all the time. So for us, that's been a really interesting point, that basically there is this unrecorded, unknown, unregulated group of people that sacrifice their bodies so that we can have our societies of control here. So I think that is like a huge, that's a huge shift that we need to be kind of like thinking about. And Jean has been very good about thinking, like, if we're thinking about societies of control and how they operate, then Jean suggests in his work the idea of turbulence in those systems of control. Because if you have a lot of control systems and they all fit into each other, the one thing that disrupts them is that they is turbulence in those systems. And then what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of, like, you know, making art in the Discovery Museum, plugging in a steam engine to a computer, bringing Dave in? Is that a kind of turbulence? You know, like, how can we then, you know, like, force those ideas of turbulence into other control systems, or how can they migrate?
And maybe like reappropriate the idea of crisis as well, because the other thing about governance nowadays is that everything is governed through crisis. So we had a financial crisis, we've got a humanitarian crisis, which ends up being usually military intervention. We have an ecological crisis, for which any types of like strong authority are required to, like, you know, sort all of us out. And I think that was one of the things that maybe we should create a little crisis, and that's also what we're trying to do by inviting different people and putting those elements together, is trying to, like, create a crisis, but a kind of like positive one that will, like, provoke I guess thought and action.
Maybe we can open it up. Questions?
It was a bit of a simple question, really. I just wondered, you just said you're in the middle of this project. I was just wondering how did it start, and what are you doing next?
The project started because I met up with Rebecca and we were talking about AV Festival, and Rebecca was telling me what she would like to do in the longer term and how she would like to connect to more local groups in the long term, and then because I have experience of doing that kind of work, maybe how we could think about it. And it all very speculative, but very, very kind of, you know, good negotiation between us and Rebecca. And so it was really thinking about what she wanted for a longer term goal for AV. It was thinking about, you know, why I had this passion to connect a steam engine to a computer, and it was putting all these things together really that it emerged as a process. And then the process has just been unfolding at each and every level, whether that's, you know, at the technical level of trying to put flesh on the end of a machine that's being fed coal, which is more of a kind of, you know, poetic vision, but also then unfolding in terms of, like, every time we got to the next stage we suddenly start thinking about the lung disease, then we start thinking about all the problems of the payments for the lawyers, then we start uncovering all these kind of unknown figures. So it's an unfolding process, and what the last couple of days has been about, and the rest of today, is really about the life process of what happens when that's in the public. And then we need to reflect on it, and then we need to think about where it goes. And one of the interesting things is that live process, you know, if it was in a museum, if it was in a gallery, wouldn't be there. And then what would be in the gallery? What would be in that, you know, more privileged space? What would you put there that would have any kind of representation or of what it is we've been doing? Is questions that we're thinking about. And the next process is that Olga, who's been working closely with us, will make a short film so that we can begin to evaluate it and begin to think about it. So that's where we're going to next, is you know, or do we go to the gala, to the union's gala? You know, where do we take it? Where does this kind of engine, where do these thoughts and actions, where can they most kind of like propagate, I suppose, is still an unresolved question. I think, is that okay?
Yeah.
This is, I really enjoyed all of these comments. I just want to come back to the question of the relationship between coal and the Green Party, which is in some ways kind of a stand-in for thinking about the future of these issues and not only about this important past that you've been describing. I think that a lot of people are very interested in miners more than they are in coal itself. That is, the mining community as a counterparty to, you know, excessively centralized and even, you know, quasi-authoritarian sort of state structures like we see in the U.S. and in Britain and in other wealthy countries right now. So a lot of folks would like to bring that back. And there's also this important, almost parasitical dependence that modernity and high technology have on miners and mining and of various minerals in the way that your project is bringing out very nicely and that you've also talked about quite eloquently. When people say coal, though, and this is especially, you know, true in the U.S. now, they think mountaintop removal, they think terrible environmental problems, and they also think about terrible labor, you know, safety issues of the kind that you talked about in China, but which are also still part of mining and in wealthier countries as well. So I'm just wondering if there's anything that we can say or that you can say about the coal as seriously an environmentally clean fuel, and not just a kind of a clean coal public relations campaign of the kind that we're seeing in the U.S. around Obama's interest in coal and nuclear as a, you know, in addition to these other fuels that he was elected to produce.
David,
and
sure.
then
let me just answer one bit.
Okay.
The thing is that all the people that ask these questions about coal are using these computers, which and their mobile phones, which have caused, you know, 6.5 million to die in the Congo to get the tantalum. So, you know, which is like a catastrophic failure. So, you know, they ask these questions in a completely hypocritical way. Why, you know, why they're continuing to mine the earth, or is it the white earth in China? In terms of environmental damage is far worse. It's like amazingly bad. So you know, I think the thing is that I don't know where coal will fit, you know what I mean, in a kind of more environmentally friendly future. But it's really important that we don't ever, you know, think that we can get any distance from the mines and from the miners and from the tantalum and from the wars that those things have caused. Miss Sarah Cook?
I guess I'd just go back to your thoughts, Graham, about art being a kind of space where these difficult issues around how we engage with control systems and communication networks can be explored. And if you think about this project in relation to other projects you've done around telephone exchanges and the Coltan Wars, do you see yourself in a way coming back full circle to being a programmer, or like reprogramming an everyday object in order to make you think about it in a different way? Do you think about it as programming, or are you thinking about it as sculpture in terms of art as being a space? Are those interesting distinctions or not?
I think largely, you know, the work that I'm involved in normally is, I think, is more like a kind of a many-headed hydra, and it exists at the kind of a technical level of trying to unfold the relations that have made up the media that we use now in a kind of historical sense. And I think that's really interesting as a kind of, you know, a speculation. But actually what gives it a kind of vibrancy and gives me confidence is when you place that in a public setting, like in the Discovery Museum, because then that starts to be about people making connections. And the energy of, you know, like yesterday, 2,000 people making connections and telling stories and relating, gives the work an amazing vibrancy for then it to maybe re-enter, you know, the gallery or wherever it's going. I think, you know, I mean, I do these projects not because I'm not very bothered what other people outside of the process of making them think. I mean, you know, what I'm interested in is, you know, like that all the people involved have gained something, and then if that has a kind of resonance for other people in another form, then it'll move off in those directions. And for me, it's very much like when we finally connected the steam engine to the computer, and that symbolic connection was made over a couple of 100 years, for me was like, you know, an amazing hack on the one hand, but it's also like, you know, I get great symbolic strength from that, and my deep motivations, I suppose, underlying a project like this, like you know, bringing back all the miners that are lost, that have made up our world, and being able to allow them to breathe through these lungs. You know, always the close relationship between, you know, the dead and media. And it doesn't matter what media systems we look at, what part of the history of media we look at, the proximity of death and the proximity of media are so close. And even with, if we look at the kind of media, all those films of people that have long since gone, you know, increasingly they're inhabited by the dead, and that's really important for me to constantly explore, whether I'm, you know, trying to echo the people that died in the Coltan Wars by building live networks with asylum seekers, or whether I'm trying to connect a 100-year-old steam engine to a computer, or talking to Dave, or looking at a database of disease or miners lost in mine accidents. So I'm always really, you know, trying to re-explore that, and then with the fantastic support of, you know, like Matsuko coordinating everything, you know, just fantastic, organised. You know, Jean then with his kind of coming in, it's amazing, someone being, you know, 30 and French, they have a way of understanding the strike and conditions in the northeast and in the UK that, like, otherwise I wouldn't get. So that's another, you know, fantastic relationship. And there's Jean's relationship with Dave and everyone else he's worked with. That's all very, very important in this whole unfolding story.